The marble corridors of Caligula's palace did not echo with the murmurs of political strategy or the debates of great men. They echoed with the stifled sobs of those begging for mercy. Under his rule, the Roman aristocracy discovered a completely new category of terror. This was a regime where fathers were pushed to auction away the purity of their own daughters, and husbands were forced to cheer while their wives were humiliated as if it was some twisted stage play. What occurred within those walls was not the random outbursts of a madman. It was intentional, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. Cruelty was no longer an exception, it had become the daily routine. Every act of depravity was logged in official records, listed just like any mundane expense of the empire. Every violation had a price tag, a protocol number, and a standard operating procedure. Through this mechanism, the greatest empire of the ancient world bowed before a machine of organized depravity. To truly understand how Rome reached this breaking point, we have to rewind the clock to the moment a smiling young man was hailed as the empire's great hope. But before we dive deeper into this descent into madness, make sure to help this community grow. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss any of our explorations into history's darkest corners. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to the world as Caligula because of the little soldier boots he wore as a child, was the adored son of Rome's most beloved general. His ascent to power was welcomed like a divine miracle. The celebrations lasted a full 100 days. To the crowds, he represented the continuation of a legendary dynasty. Senators finally exhaled, relaxing after years of suffocating paranoia under Emperor Tiberius. No one imagined that this charismatic, well-educated, and charming young man would become the mastermind behind the most structured system of moral corruption Rome would ever witness. His early years, however, were a dangerous blend of privilege and trauma. He was raised among soldiers who worshipped his father, yet he also witnessed the darkest underbelly of imperial politics, the suspicious death of his father likely by poison, the exile of his mother, Agrippina the Elder, and the execution of his brothers. Caligula survived this slaughter by mastering a single skill, playing a role. He became the harmless fool, the non-threatening jester. Growing up in Tiberius's palace taught him a critical lesson in Rome: survival depended on the art of deception. When he first took the throne, everything looked flawless. He cut taxes, released political prisoners, staged spectacular public games, built aqueducts, and rewarded the legions. Rome fell in love with him. Women scattered flowers in his path. Children sang songs in his praise. The very senators who would later tremble at the sound of his footsteps fought for a mere moment of eye contact. It felt as though Rome's golden age had finally arrived. Unlike the isolated Tiberius, Caligula walked among the people, dining with senators and sharing in the public joy. He was the ideal ruler the gods had promised. Then, in the autumn of 37 AD, everything changed. A mysterious illness struck him down. For weeks, he hovered on the brink of death. Court doctors documented fevers hotter than they thought a human could survive, violent convulsions requiring multiple men to restrain him, and delirious episodes where he claimed to be speaking directly with Jupiter. Rome was paralyzed with fear. Priests sacrificed endlessly. Citizens vowed their own lives in exchange for the emperor's recovery. And when he finally opened his eyes, something fundamental inside him had shifted. The first sign was subtle but eerie. He commanded that the heads of every statue of a god in Rome be removed and replaced with his own likeness. After that, the transformation became impossible to ignore. They say a person's body reveals the truth long before their words do. Caligula's body, after that illness, told a story of something profoundly disturbing. His eyes, once lively and warm, turned hollow and predatory, the pupils unnaturally wide. He developed relentless insomnia, wandering the palace through the night, whispering to statues, speaking to the moon, and responding to unseen enemies. Servants often found him at dawn, naked in the palace gardens, covered in soil, claiming he had been planting Rome's destiny. But what he planted was not a future, it was the foundation for a descent into absolute darkness. The collapse began within his own household. His sisters Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger ceased to be family and became the first victims of a perversion that would turn into state policy. His fixation on Drusilla was extreme. He called her his Diana, treating her as an empress in public. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula spiraled into a frantic rage. He ordered a mourning period so strict that laughter, bathing, and even family meals were forbidden. Anyone displaying happiness was executed, but this grief was not love. It was the fury of a man who felt his property had been stolen by death itself. With Drusilla gone, his predatory gaze shifted to his remaining sisters, and then to the wives and daughters of Rome's elite. This is where the system truly began to operate. Caligula forced noblewomen to participate in acts with senators while he observed from a specially crafted golden throne, taking notes on who seemed eager, who hesitated, and who simply tried to be polite. These notes were later weaponized as political leverage. A senator who behaved enthusiastically toward Julia Livilla suddenly found himself supporting every imperial order. Another who showed reluctance found his young son missing, only for the boy to be returned days later, castrated as a grim warning. In Caligula's Rome, neutrality did not exist. Everyone was forced to be either an offender or a victim, often both. Hidden for centuries in a villa near Pompeii, the writings of the Roman physician Lucius Scriba detail how Caligula forced him to examine noblewomen and girls. These examinations were not for health, but to assess their fertility and their ability to endure repeated use, performed in front of the emperor himself. These humiliating inspections were accompanied by invasive, degrading questions. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was organized, bureaucratic, and executed with the precision of a census. Rates and fees were standardized. Caligula had transformed personal depravity into a government department, a machine designed to crush dignity, eliminate resistance, and turn Rome's nobility into obedient instruments of his power. 16 sestertii for a night with a senator's wife. 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 if he wanted both at once. The payments didn't disappear into private pockets. They were logged as voluntary contributions for the good of the state and flowed directly into the imperial treasury. The palace itself became what Caligula insisted on calling a temple of divine service. He meant it literally. He refitted rooms, corridors, and rituals to function like a sacramental machine. Each chamber had a name and a function. There was the room of Jupiter, where the emperor cast himself as a living god bestowing favors. There was the chamber of Venus, staged for enforced ceremonies where noble matrons were forced to recreate mythic scenes. There was even a hall associated with Priapus, where acts of humiliation were carried out against those the emperor chose to break. He travertine halls that had once hosted debates about war and law now echoed to very different sounds. And the men who had built Rome, the senators, were made to walk those same corridors, to hear what happened inside, and to remain silent. The system was intricate beyond imagination. First in the chain were the senators' wives, drafted into what the emperor called the imperial cult. They followed schedules, wore designated uniforms of sheer Syrian silk, and performed rituals according to strict timetables. Even more horrifying was the program described in secret memos as selective breeding. Women judged most fertile were compelled to bear children destined to be raised as imperial dependents. Children separated from their fathers and trained from infancy to serve court needs. Every conception, every birth, every infant death was noted in the ledgers. Many pregnancies ended in desperate attempts to prevent childbirth, a grim statistic recorded coldly by scribes. Men were not exempt. Caligula ordered the feminization of the sons of patrician houses. They were dressed in diaphanous saffron tunics, their faces painted with white lead and vermilion, taught to move and gesture in ways he found pleasing. These boys were paraded at banquets and auctioned for the night. The emperor's involvement was rarely about desire, it was about domination. Each act, each public violation was a deliberate political statement. Nothing is sacred that I cannot defile. No tradition is safe from my touch, no family is immune from collapse. Perhaps the most savage innovation was how he enlisted families in their own ruin. Parents were forced not just to witness, but to collude. They were torchbearers in processions, signatories on contracts consenting to the service of their wives and daughters. The Senate was pressed to pass laws that cloaked abuse with religious legitimacy. One such statute declared the emperor's body sacred, framing any union with him as a form of worship. It was legal architecture built to sanctify the emperor's violations. Caligula discovered a cruelty beyond physical force, coercive complicity. He didn't only attack families from the outside. He turned them into instruments of their own destruction. Take the case of Senator Cornelius. When summoned to hand over his wife, Livia, he stood up in the Senate and refused. It was a public act of defiance, brave, but fatal in its consequences. The next morning, Cornelius's 8-year-old son was discovered on the Senate steps. Alive, but mutilated, with a message unmistakably carved into his flesh. The warning worked. That afternoon, Cornelius delivered Livia to the emperor. Months later, when she conceived by imperial decree, Cornelius was forced to recognize the child as the legitimate heir, abandoning any claims from his other offspring. Humiliation had been made law. Running this apparatus required an administration that rivaled Rome's civil government. Hidden clerks kept meticulous registers in a sealed archive beneath the Palatine. Each file followed a template: victim's name, age, social rank, physical description, acts performed, duration, degree of apparent cooperation, resulting pregnancies, fees paid. Yes, the emperor charged for these services, and the proceeds flowed into imperial coffers. Hundreds of people became cogs in this machine. There were prosecutors of propriety, caretakers of ritual clothing, official midwives, the scribes who wrote the lists, guards who enforced the timetables, and accountants who balanced the books. The dispersion of responsibility made it easier for individuals to avoid moral ownership. Nobody stood alone as the monster. Everyone could claim they were merely fulfilling a role. Certain nights were ritualized as spectacles. Full moons were prime time. Caligula staged lunar fertility rites in a converted private amphitheater, turning it into a staged pagan temple. He arranged matches with carefully selected participants, gladiators famed for their vigor, Nubian captives brought from the empire's frontiers, and even animals. Husbands sat in the galleries in their senatorial togas, forced to maintain composure while their wives were degraded below them. The emperor orchestrated every detail like a ringmaster, deciding pairings, numbers, duration, and even body positioning using a gilded baton topped with phallic symbols. Scribes documented everything. What played out was less chaos than a theatre of dominance, an institution where human suffering was converted into pageantry and then commodified. An entire shadow economy grew up around the palace's needs. Vendors sold ointments claimed to ease pain, clandestine apothecaries supplied abortions, and tutors taught young survivors how to mimic compliance. Doctors opened practices focused on repair and reconstruction. Everyone who touched the system charged a fee. Everyone who touched it profited. And that profit is what made it so durable. Greed lubricated complicity. Vanity, fear, ambition all became incentives to look away, to obey, to participate. The horror was not simply that Caligula could commit atrocities. It was that he engineered a society where atrocity paid. The official histories never recorded what the human bodies in the palace lived through, but those bodies told their own stories. Scars formed like a private alphabet of pain, bellies swelled with pregnancies. Women tried to hide beneath layered garments, faces stopped smiling. The facial muscles of joy atrophied from years of disuse. There was Valeria, the daughter of a senator, who after months of ongoing abuse, fell entirely silent. Doctors confirmed her vocal cords worked. She hadn't lost the ability to speak, she had simply lost the language to describe what she endured. Her silence spread through the other victims like a contagion. They would not meet her eyes because, in them, they saw reflection of the fate awaiting them. Caligula's obsessions evolved into ritualized cruelties. He took perverse satisfaction in making mothers watch damage done to their daughters, then reversing roles to force mothers into the very acts inflicted on their children. In his mind, he was simply updating the old myths. Gods who violated mortals were relics legitimizing his deeds. Zeus disguised himself as beasts. Caligula made the same violence bureaucratic. Attempts to resist were desperate and almost always fatal. Some women stole poison. Others disfigured themselves with knives, hoping to render themselves useless to the system. But imperial physicians were skilled in restoring merchandise. The imperial archive swelled with entries. Thousands upon thousands of records. each more detailed than the last. The bookkeeping of atrocity became as exacting as the ledgers of taxes. Caligula sometimes showcased the ledger itself as an instrument of terror. He would read selections aloud in the Senate, selecting names at random, forcing fathers and husbands to hear the clinical descriptions. Entry 346, Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius. For ours, 6 participants, pregnancy confirmed, public disgrace was part of the sentence. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite protectors, were not bystanders. They were embedded in the system, often rewarded with victims. However, one such man, Cassius Chaerea, was a veteran soldier who had been mocked and humiliated by Caligula. The mocking was petty at first, taunts about his voice, orders to perform demeaning tasks, but humiliation piled on humiliation until something in Chaerea snapped. It wasn't an awakening of compassion so much as fury at his own debasement. On the night of January 24, 41 CE, a final brutal ceremony was staged. Caligula intended it as the apex of his public pageants. Wives of senators were pitted against gladiators in an auction-like competition. Numbers were called out like livestock. It was the last spectacle. The next day, as Caligula moved through an underground passage toward the theatre, Chaerea and a group of Praetorian conspirators ambushed him. They stabbed him repeatedly, dozens of wounds, including a deliberate strike to the genitals, a symbolic reversal of the emperor's humiliations. The irony was bitter. The same men who had helped enable the system were the ones who ended the man at its center. Caligula's wife, Melonia Caesonia, was murdered shortly afterwards. His young daughter, barely more than a child, was also killed. The conspirators intended to wipe out the dynasty entirely. Yet even with the emperor gone, the damage remained. The new emperor, Claudius, declared a damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Statues were toppled, inscriptions chiseled away, coins melted down. Official memory was censored, but paper and people remembered. The children born under the breeding program grew up without knowing their origins. Victims aged with secrets sealed inside them. Fathers who had once held torches in state ceremonies could never look their daughters in the eye again. Caligula had died, but he left behind more than a corpse. He left a blueprint. The manual for institutionalized cruelty, the registers, the legal precedents, these did not vanish. Without protective families, without laws to shield the vulnerable, new generations learned that certain evils survive beyond their architects. In the end, the echo of that night was the most damning testament. Men applauded an act of murder with the same hands that had once held torches for the rituals. The empire moved on outwardly, but inwardly the wounds remained. Caligula had not simply indulged in depravity. He had written the instructions for turning atrocity into governance. And manuals, once written, are never truly gone.